Hey everyone, it's Horror Free for All, and I hope you're doing well today. I'm sorry for the lack of reviews on this channel recently. I know it's been a few months since I promised my carnival horror movie reviews, which I do still plan on covering here. I'm just really backed up. And honestly, I haven't really been watching a lot of horror movies recently or reading adult horror books. I just haven't had the energy because recently I got a new job in my real life situation, and it's like a normal 9 to 5 Monday through Friday gig, and just had a lot of push and pull this summer than I thought I would. Going to see family, going to do things with friends, you name it, doing stuff with the girlfriend. It eats up a lot of your spare time, and I apologize to you all that I haven't been making content out there. But I do plan on getting back to my carnival horror movie reviews after this review because I really want to get this one out of the way because I think many people need to hear about this film. This film came out in 2024. It was written and directed by Kia Roach Turner, and it had a limited theatrical run. And recently, places like Walmart got the DVD copy in, which I have right here in my hand. And the movie in question is Sting. Now, I heard about this movie, sadly, after the fact it was in theaters, and I never saw a trailer for it. This is one of those films that kind of escaped me, like that movie I covered last year called Natty Knox, which once I heard about it, I needed to check it out. And I heard from my good friend, the Horrorlander, who's been going to pretty much every mainstream 2024 horror film, that this was one of his favorites and up there with like Late Night with the Devil and some other films that he saw this year that he really loved. And I have to say, I have watched quite a few 2024 horror movies that I've heard a lot about. Like the Jason Voorhees ripoff slasher that's in his POV. I forget what the movie's called, but I saw that, wasn't that impressed. I saw Low Lives, thought it was kind of being touted in an overrated way, but liked it fine enough. And then I saw movies like Late Night with the Devil, and I thought that was a really great film. And then this one now, which I think is definitely probably the biggest sleeper hit of this year for me. Honestly, in some aspects, even though I think I love Late Night with the Devil a little more, I think I love this movie more in some aspects to it. This is one of those dumb, fun, goosebumps for adults type of films, or you can kind of correlate this to being like a creep show segment turned into a full movie. There's a lot of just goofy things about it and some funny humor and just some classic creature feature aesthetic to it that makes this automatically now one of my favorite spider movies. And I've seen quite a few in my time. I've even seen some lower budget from the early 2000s stuff, some 1950s classic sci-fi stuff. But this is now up there with movies like Arachnophobia and Eight-Legged Freaks as one of my favorites. I love this movie in a lot of ways. It's not perfect by any means, and we'll get into that later on. But yeah, this is easily one of my favorite horror films of 2024, and probably one of the most underrated films to come out in the past 5 years in the horror genre that had some sort of publicity to it. So if you haven't checked out Sting, you need to check it out, right? So with that out the way, let's get into the plot and review without giving too much away. So the movie starts off with this meteorite of sorts kind of falling down into this very snowy township of sorts, and it's possibly like a certain section of a city, and it lands in this high-rise building with a bunch of apartments. It crashes through a window, and it lands inside this dollhouse. And then once we get to see through the credit montage of what it is, it starts to break open, kind of like an egg of sorts, and a little baby spider crawls out of it into the house. And this pretty much kicks off the whole event of the movie and the inciting incident. Yeah, it's random and kind of goofy, but you just gotta roll with it from this point. But this little girl named Charlotte, who I guess is like in her grandmother or great aunt's apartment building section for some reason, is like broken into her room and is playing around. And then notice that there's a hole in the top of the dollhouse, and she looks inside and finds this spider. And she thinks that it's so cool that she's gonna like take it and pretty much keep it like a pet because her parents doesn't let her have pets for some reason, as we'll see in the story. But Charlotte hears some noise, and she kind of breaks for it and heads back to her apartment, where she's basically being raised by her biological mom and her stepdad. and her mom is pregnant with another child, and Charlotte's like, obviously going to be 12 years older than her new sibling, or maybe she's already had a baby. I think she might have already had the baby, yeah. Um, and her stepdad seems to be very invested in her and wants her to, like, have some normal hobbies, but they're all trapped in because of the snow anyways. And the dad seems to be maybe like a maintenance worker or a plumber, and he gets called throughout the building from the building owner to kind of go around and inspect apartments, and we get to see him kind of messing around with some pipes of a fellow neighbor who might play a role later on in the story, maybe via a death scene. And the neighbor's complaining about the cockroaches infesting the building and all that, and so he's kind of saying, yeah, the landowner's a piece of crap, and she herself is kind of like a cockroach coming to, just take all of her money and giving us nothing. So there's some attempt at commentary for, living conditions for, lower income people, I guess, going on here. And we also see in the beginning of the movie, I haven't really touched on this, but this is one of those films that kind of start out with a scene that takes place later on in the movie to kind of grip you. And we see this old woman early on. She's kind of humming around after she's called an exterminator because she hears some banging in the walls, and there's some, like, weird hissing noises, and the exterminator starts to go around the room to investigate. And let's just say that we see him possibly get attacked by what we can only assume is a giant spider within the walls of the building. So we already know that this little spider is probably going to end up being this big spider. And Charlotte, immediately after she, is talking with her parents and all that, and her stepdad leaves to go work on the neighbor's plumbing of sorts, she's in her room and she's kind of playing around with the spider and learns that the spider has these weird abilities to kind of communicate with her. Like when she whistles or hums a certain thing, it kind of echoes it back and seemingly understands what she's doing. And so she's like, all right, are you hungry? Let me feed you. So she takes like an earth insect and puts it in there and sees it gets like sucked up to the top of the jar where the thing is making a nest. And Charlotte's blown away by how quickly the spider is, is eating prey and all that. And as we see in the movie, as Charlotte and these other characters start interacting with each other, that the spider is growing bigger and bigger in size. Well, there's also some drama going on early on as well, because unbeknownst to Charlotte, as she starts feeding the spider tends to want to break out of its jar that it's captured in as it's growing a little bit in size, and wants to go after bigger prey. And we see that this neighbor, who I think is the grandma figure or somebody, I think that's what it is, she gets her bird pretty much eaten in a graphic way from the inside out. And Charlotte's stepdad investigates, the turmoil going on with that, and says, well, I don't know what happened to this bird, but something killed it. And Charlotte, she doesn't know what to make of it yet. But as the movie goes along, and as these weird things start happening, I don't want to go into too many spoilers with what the spider does. They start to kind of pinpoint the idea that something like monstrous might be in the building. And Charlotte notices that the spider is starting to grow really big. She's going to have to move it to essentially, give it a bigger home. So there's a fellow neighbor who has a terrarium of sorts, or maybe like a fish tank where they put it in. And the neighbor is like, well, I'll take care of the spider for you. And this is where the stepdad kind of learns of the spider's whereabouts and all that, and freaks out on Charlotte, saying that she can't have a spider, and it's crazy that she has one as a pet to begin with. But once she pawns off the spider and goes back to her own apartment again, the neighbor kind of wants to see what the spider is capable of. So basically, he tries to encourage it to do some killing of sorts, which is kind of deranged. But let's just say the spider starts to break out and get bigger and bigger, and possibly might be coming after people. And I went over I went over a certain thing because while the spider was still kind of small before it started to get really big, there's a really gross death sequence that happens with the neighbor lady with the cockroaches I mentioned earlier. Uh, and it's really graphic. But yeah, that was gnarly shit, man. But we get a sense that this thing is murderous, right? And it's may or may not start to go on this murderous rampage. And because it's gotten so big, it now has to use the vents within the walls to kind of make its habitat, right? And this is where we get the call to the exterminator, and the exterminator now comes into the story, and we get more background of why the exterminator is there and all that. And then, of course, he kind of escapes the story. The drama continues to unfold, where the spider perhaps is coming after Charlotte's family now, and she is tasked with kind of watching her little sister or brother or something like that, and her parents get taken out of the situation and taken into the spider's lair, where I don't know if it plans on having babies to feed them to the babies or whatnot, but the parents are up there after they've been brutally attacked, and then Charlotte comes across the exterminator who has escaped being trapped in there, and he's all messed up and fucked up in the face from the interaction, and he's like, why would you want to raise a spider as a pet? All this happened because of you. And Charlotte's like, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. And then the stepdad overhears this, and it finds a way to escape and says, Charlotte, this isn't your fault, but we're going to have to fight this spider, and you're going to have to kill Sting so we can get out of this situation. And this is where the climax unfolds in the movie, where we see what's going to happen with Sting, essentially, and possibly what's going to happen with the stepdad. And then once we find out the aftermath of that, the movie kind of fades to black, and there might be some soft sequel bait potential there going on. So that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of Sting. And like I said, I went over a lot of surface level things because there's a lot of in-depth character stuff in the movie that I could really wean down, but just go experience the movie for yourself. So yeah, Sting. I have a lot to say about this movie, and one thing that I think this movie does very well is make a claustrophobic atmosphere. There's something about the apartment complex and it being set in like the cold and dead of winter that makes you feel a sense of uneasiness, because they really do feel like they're trapped in the building. They have really nowhere to go feasibly, and they can't like escape the town if the spider escapes the building or anything. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that really does make me feel unsettled throughout the story, especially with how the movie opens, and you're like, okay, they give us a little taste of what's going to come, but how does it lead up to this? And I will say that in doing so with the atmosphere, the film does take its methodical time kind of building up the stakes within the horror itself, and watching Sting kind of grow from a baby spider to a monstrous giant spider, you know, man-eating mutant alien bug thing was super fun. And that goes without saying, all the characters in this movie either have really relatable traits that make them, you know, obviously sympathetic, or they have lovable traits because they're written to be funny and they have some funny line delivery, like the exterminator guy, like some of the neighbors, and the bitchy landlord of sorts. They're all fun characters. Charlotte, for it being a kid-centered movie around majorly a kid narrative, Charlotte had a pretty understandable story going for her, and I really like that aspect to it. And the gore and the violence, the practical effects dealing with some of these deaths in here, while it is kind of spread around, and there is implications of animal violence in the movie that I can see some people might being a little touchy with, it's some good shit. Most of this movie is practical effects minus the CGI spider, which isn't even bad at all. This is honestly probably the best CGI spider work I've ever seen in a movie, so take that for what you will. But holy crap, man, the practical gore with some of these deaths and some of these injuries these people face is gnarly. And the spider lair near the back half of the movie, that shit reminded me of the alien nests from the movie Aliens by James Cameron, right? Just mind-blowing shit. And you wouldn't think that this movie would kind of be packing that punch in it, but it really does, man. And it just feels like a classic horror movie trying to tackle a really B movie plot uh, as well going forward. I don't know how to explain it. It feels like a traditional horror setup, but imagine if you took something batshit crazy from a 50s sci-fi movie or an 80s B movie and you try to overlay it on top. That's how this movie comes across, and I really enjoyed for that. It has an identity to it. It makes it stick out to other Spider movies for me. Yeah, there might be some disbelief you got to put at the door with an alien egg kind of crash landing into this building. Yeah, what a coinky dink going on there, but the movie makes up for its kind of shortcuts it has by having just so much fun and knowing how to scare you and knowing how to be entertaining at the same time and even emotional. There are some themes kind of woven in this story, which is kind of why I feel like this is kind of like if you took a creep show segment and try to make it a full movie. I don't know how long this movie is. Let me check for you. It's only 91 minutes. This movie flies by for the most part. There are some slow moments, I would say, early on, maybe in that first 30 minutes. It does take a little bit to kind of kick on to what it becomes. But I would say that the exposition is rather nice for this movie, given the context of what comes later on. So I'm not going to be that harsh on it, but we will get into that in the negatives. But it felt like a breeze to watch, especially once it starts to click on. It's fun. It's entertaining. Yeah, there's a lot of character dialogue that some people might not be into. And the movie does build a lot of character relationships and take its time with that as well. If that's not what you're looking for, you're probably not going to like it as much as I did. But I enjoyed that as well. And that feeds into the themes of these people being essentially poor and kind of destitute and pretty much reliant on living here just to be able to afford to live where they live. And seeing all these people in this community that kind of understand this situation and the context of certain characters that bite the dust in the movie, some of it feels like, oh, maybe they didn't deserve to die, but somebody had to die to make the movie, bloody and stuff. And then some of the people you're like rooting for when something bad happens to them. So it's a weird conundrum going on there where it actually makes you invested and care about these characters, which is pretty good for a small budget horror film like this. You wouldn't think that, but there's a lot of sound positives with it. Now, with the negatives, these are pretty cut and dry. All I have to really say about this movie, it's boring at certain points, and especially in like the first 30 minutes, it kind of drags a little bit. It doesn't have the best, I don't know, it doesn't have the best build after that cold open, after that montage sequence of the credits and how the spider comes into the story. After that point, it does take quite a little bit of time to click on and get to what the movie's trying to be. And during that point of the movie, you're building up characters and establishing relationships and going over some off-screen dynamics that have been occurring before we see the events of the film. You gotta catch up to base with the characters to know where they're at and how the story's going to play out for some of them. Sadly, but if that's really the only biggest negative with it, then I'm fine with it because the movie does click on, and for the final hour of it, it gets just ramped up and it becomes so much fun. And with that out the way, I guess my last negative with it, and this is still a pretty medium one for me, is that there's just not a lot of gore in the movie. You would think that in a high-rise building, there would be a lot more carnage going on, but it just feels a little too small scale, and I think that's where the budget starts to kind of reflect here. I was hoping for a way bigger scope with the spider than what we're given in the film, sadly. But I kind of get why, because like I said, it's a low-budget movie. They don't have a lot of money for extras, but it could have been a lot more grander than it actually was. And that's just food for thought stuff there. But nonetheless, I had a blast with this movie. I think a lot of you, if you didn't check this movie out when it came out in theaters, or maybe you're kind of on the fence to buy this movie in physical, go buy this for your collection. I don't know if it's going to resonate as high for you as it did for me, but I had so much fun with this movie, and you're getting a glowing recommendation from me. If I had to rate this thing, I'd probably give it like a 4.5 out of 5 stars, honestly. Don't listen to people on the internet kind of giving this thing middling reviews. I know there's some people, after I watched the movie, I went out to kind of look on Letterboxd and IMDb to see some reviewer or fan reactions. There's some people really beating this movie over the head for being low budget and stuff. And why would you beat up a low budget movie that has some heart? You know what I mean? Just people need to get out of their mindsets of this big budget horror shit and just learn to appreciate the smaller stuff that are actually delivering the juice and the goods here. This is one of those movies that, like I said, it's not perfect, but for what it is, it does what it's trying to do really well. And it's funny, it's gory at times, has some heart to it, and that's all you can really ask for. Fun time all the way around. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Sting from 2024. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this movie or maybe if you've heard about it. Do you have any interest and want to watch it? And also, if you watched it, do you love it? Do you hate it? I'm dying to know. I'll see you next time.